first time in the book of Luke where the reaction of Jesus is widespread. Jesus is going from just a normal teacher that's somewhat gaining popularity to somebody that's truly known throughout all the land, illustrating the public perception of Jesus shifting towards him being somebody that is known at the very least as a great prophet of Israel. And today's message is important because of that shift that takes place in the attitudes of the peoples, because of the kind of miracle that is performed, because of this change that we see through this miracle at Nain. See, Luke writes of resurrection accounts a number of times. It was somewhere between 3 and 4 different times does he write about resurrections in the book of Luke and Acts. And of those resurrections, this is the first time he's writing about it. This is the first resurrection that we see. And Luke is the gospel that we turn to kind of figure out the chronology of when Jesus did different things. So this was likely the very first resurrection that Jesus ever performed. If we were to just kind of follow a general consensus, this is the first time the people of Israel have seen a resurrection in 500, maybe even 1,000 years. It's been a long time since they'd last seen a resurrection. And in this story, it's Luke pointing to the fact that not only can Jesus heal diseases, the people are starting to figure that out, but maybe Jesus is something a little bit more than just a great healer, than just a great teacher. This sparks the people's attention to come to recognize that, wow, this Jesus has a lot of power. This Jesus is truly somebody remarkable, somebody else. So, was a lot of build-up. Let's read Luke chapter 7, starting at verse 11. It says this: "Soon afterward, he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a great crowd went with him. As he drew near to the gate of the town, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a considerable crowd from the town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, 'Do not weep.' Then he came up and touched the bier, and the bearers stood still. And he said, 'Young man, I say to you, arise.' And the dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized them all, and they glorified God, saying, 'A great prophet has arisen among us, and God has visited his people.' And this report spread through the whole of Judea and all the surrounding countries." The point of Luke 7, 11 through 17 is that not only can Jesus heal, but that he can override death. Luke is painting a picture of Jesus and the power that Jesus holds, the power over death that he holds. And he's painting a picture that this power that he holds can only come from God. And the people, Luke describes, they see it and they react to it. Before I go any further, I want to talk a little bit about historians. As a kid, history was my favorite subject. I didn't care too much for anything else, but history was something I loved. Hearing stories about great Roman emperors, powerful men doing powerful things, kings that made a lasting impact on the world, those are my favorites. But as a kid, I was always focused on the big picture people. I very rarely was focused on the little people, how society in general could change the land. That changed a few years ago. My dad actually suggested, back when I was still living with him, we watch a documentary that PBS was publishing called The Vietnam War. And at the time, I knew nothing about the Vietnam War, not a thing. But I figured I'd give it a shot. My dad wanted to watch this with me. It's this 18-hour, 10-episode documentary. It's huge. It's a big documentary. And it's written and directed by this guy named Ken Burns, who's the most famous documentarian kind of living today. So we start this documentary, and it turns out not to really be so much about the Vietnam War as just an all-encompassing history lesson from the 1950s all the way to the 80s. And only less than half is about the war. What Ken Burns consistently does is he describes the war, and then he cuts back to the reaction of the people back at home, checking in on how the public consistently shifted in their thoughts and their attitudes throughout the time. Every time a village is burned or bombs are dropped, let's cut back. How is America reacting to this? What are they thinking? What are they doing? How are they changing? And I think that's the sign of a great historian, to not just show the events that happened, but how those events shaped public perception. And today, here in the Gospel of Luke, we see Luke doing very much the same thing, like any great historian should do. Luke, he's known as the physician. He's the gospel you turn to when you want all the little details of the life of Jesus, when you want a bunch of additional facts. Luke's the guy to turn to. And the healing of the story at Nain, it's not in the other three Gospels. Yet, Luke uses this story as a linchpin. It's his focus-centered story to talk about the public's perception of Jesus shifting, to showcase that Jesus is more than just a man in the eyes of the people. No, they're starting to figure out, this guy, he's not just a man, he's not just a great teacher, he's not just a great healer, he's from God. He's one of the great prophets. He may even be God himself. God come to earth. So in our story this morning, we're going to get into point one, which is the setting. We see Jesus approach the city of Nain, and he draws near to the city gate. Many of the commentaries I read made mention that the town of Nain is not actually mentioned anywhere else in the Bible. And the exact location, as a result, is kind of unknown, or at the very least, hotly debated. What we do know about this small, out-of-the-way town was that, well, if it's small, it probably was also out of the way, if we don't have any recollection of it. And so, this wouldn't have been Jerusalem. This was just a small place that Jesus decided to stop to. A small place where word probably wouldn't travel quickly or fast, where people would have to almost verify the accounts. Some commentators think it would have been just a few miles south of Nazareth, but again, we don't really know. What we do know is Luke makes mention of the city's gate. And when we think of a gate in Bible times, we think of Jerusalem, a giant city where people would have been waging war. I don't think that's the kind of gate you should picture in our setting today. I think you should think of more of a small town. This gate would have been more likely a decorative piece to signify, hey, you're entering the city. It probably, on the day of a funeral, would have been decorated as such, decorated in mourning for these people who were observing this funeral process. And here, as the funeral procession is leaving the town to bury their dead, Jesus enters, and he sees this procession. Luke writes that a considerable crowd from the town was in the procession. So while the town is sharing their grief with this woman as they gather, it's still a time of deep mourning. And while the town is with her at this time, giving her comfort, providing for her, being there alongside of her, Luke also makes special mention to say something about who this woman was. Well, who is this mother? Let's look at the text. What does Luke say? Luke writes, she is a widow who is now childless. He makes note to point out this woman, despite the town being with her during the funeral, is completely alone in the world, an orphaned parent. And he's painting a tragedy. The only son of this widowed woman has now died, and she is alone. And while the town is comforting her, when all is said and done, she'd be left just to fend for herself. And it's in this setting of sadness and tragedy and heartbreak that Luke writes, and when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, in verse 13. As I said, last week in Luke 7, 1 through 10, was a clear articulation of the gospel message. Last week, the story was from start to finish a message on how faith can save. The story this week is the opposite, is showing how a miracle can provide for faith of people. A man approached Jesus last week, and because of that faith, his servant was healed. But the miracle this week is not from anybody coming to Jesus with great faith. In fact, Jesus is not even asked to heal a person. It's the opposite. Much in the same way that Jesus, God in flesh, became a man not because he had to save us, but instead because he chose to save us, so too does Jesus perform this miracle simply out of an extension of his great love and compassion. So point 2, Jesus heals with compassion. In an act that's rare for him, Jesus takes the initiative and addresses the woman as he prepares to deal with her tragic situation. Sure, Jesus often performs miracles without being asked, but more often than not, when you read the Gospels, a miracle is performed when somebody comes to Jesus. That's more commonly what we see. People lowered their loved ones into ceilings just to get them to see Jesus. There was a story of a woman who just needed to just touch Jesus' garment. Time and time again, people come to him to be healed, to be comforted. Yet, it's uncommon to see Jesus reaching out to someone without even being recognized or asked. And so, before even the miracle occurs, Jesus offers this woman a word of comfort. He asks her, "Stop crying." He doesn't do this in a forceful way. This isn't some rude, "Hey, stop crying, you should know better." But it's simply to prepare her for the miracle itself that is going to occur. This miracle is something that will carry her tears away. This miracle is something that will offer comfort in a way that no amount of words could ever offer comfort. Jesus' comfort will include more than anyone else can give her. He will offer more than words. He will offer action with the result of the resurrection of her son. A prevailing theme throughout the Gospel of Luke is that Jesus, God, is coming in aid of the defenseless. He's coming in aid of those who most need help. Those who feel they are on the outside, those who feel abandoned, can sense Jesus' invitation to experience God's renewing blessing in their lives, to experience God's salvation in their lives. God is visiting his people again, and those who realize his presence can sense their need for God can engage with Jesus and receive the miracles that Jesus provides. And so, Jesus' action that would bring comfort to this crying mother and widow is one of authority that reflects how he operates throughout his ministry. Jesus, he approaches the funeral procession, and then he touches what would be considered unclean. And some commentators, they kind of disagree as to what this touching would be. Is he touching so that he can heal the boy? Is this simply a reaching out and a touching to stop the funeral procession, to touch the bearers and say, "Hey, stop, we're going to heal the child"? Commentators are a little unsure. Whatever the reason, what we do see is after this touch, Jesus addresses the dead man with his voice. He calls out to the dead man authoritatively and commands him to get up. He heals the man with his voice, just like we saw last week when Jesus healed the servant with his words. Healed a servant that he wasn't even nearby, just with his words. A resurrection like this is without a doubt a miracle that could come only from God, that only God could perform. When we hear about a story of a resurrection, our minds might immediately jump to, well, how does this tie in with the resurrection of Christ? How does this tie in with our salvation through Christ's resurrection? Yet, this resurrection, while it's important, and I'm going to point to what makes this resurrection important, I don't think this resurrection carries any salvific implications for our lives. It is instead just another sign that points to Jesus being the Messiah. The purpose of miracles were to be a sign to the people. And so, just as many of Jesus' other miracles are simply signs that point to him being the Messiah, that point to him being God, so too is this just another sign. It's an amazing sign. It's a wonderful sign. It's the first resurrection he performs, but it's just a sign to point to his deity. It's a huge sign, and one that the people, they obviously don't miss. They understand the significance. But I don't think we should tie this into our own salvation or anything into the resurrection of Christ and who he is too much. So what Luke writes next is a reaction to this miracle. I talked about great historians don't just write what happened, they write how that changed. And I think the crux of what Luke is trying to get at is the people's reaction to this. The people both begin declaring Jesus to be a prophet, a great prophet, and they praise God because of Jesus' miracle. When the people declared Jesus to be a great prophet, they are undeniably comparing him to two people. When you think great prophet, who do you think? Hopefully it's Elijah and Elisha. Those are the two big ones in the Old Testament, the two great prophets who did great miracles. And in Old Testament history, those would have been the upper echelon. There would have been a tier list. There would have been categories for who was great prophets, who was okay prophets, and who was just a minor prophet. They would have known that. And they're trying to figure out, where does Jesus fit into this? And I want to do a bit of a compare and contrast between Jesus, Elijah, and Elisha. See, those two prophets, while being at the top, they're the top prophets of the day. They're also, in the Old Testament, the only two people who resurrect somebody. We have two resurrections before this in the entirety of the Old Testament, and it's both those two prophets. So I want to read those two stories to kind of see how these compare and contrast. Let's start with Elijah in 1 Kings 17. If you want to turn there, we're going to be reading a big section. 1 Kings 17 through 24 is the story of Elijah raising somebody from the dead. It says this: After this, the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, became ill, and his illness was so severe that there was no breath left in him. And she said to Elijah, "What have you against me, O man of God? You could have come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to cause the death of my son." And he said to her, "Give me your son." And he took him from her arms and carried him up to the upper chamber where he lodged and laid him on his own bed. And he cried out to the Lord, "O Lord my God, you have brought calamity even upon the widow with whom I sojourned by killing her son." Then he stretched himself upon the child 3 times and cried to the Lord, "O Lord my God, let this child's life come into him again." And the Lord listened to the voice of Elijah, and the life of the child came into him again, and he revived. And Elijah took the child and brought him down from the upper chamber into the house and delivered him to his mother. And Elijah said, "See, your son lives." And the woman said to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord is in your mouth, that is in your mouth is true." So what can we compare? The stories are remarkably similar in a number of ways. It's the story of a grieving mother, a single mother, apparently, who has lost her son, her only son. And it's the story of a powerful man who, through the power of God, is able to resurrect the son. Clear comparisons. It's no wonder they would have recognized Jesus to be a great prophet. So those are the obvious that show how the two are similar. But it's important to see that the connections go beyond just the comparison. Let's contrast these. What we see that Jesus' miracle is that it is far greater than that of Elijah's. When Jesus raises the dead man, what does the dead man do? He sits up instantly. Elijah had to stretch himself onto the child. He had to cry out to God to raise him in a great calling out of power to God. So Jesus is instantaneous. Secondly, not only is Jesus' resurrection instantaneous of the boy, but the healing of the boy is complete. Luke records that he gets up then and there and he's healed. In the story of Elijah, Elijah brings the boy back to life, but the picture of the boy is that he is still weak, with barely any life in him. Elijah has to bring the body back down to the mother. All right, let's look at that second story, the other resurrection story in 2 Kings. This one is of the story of Elisha. The story is a bit longer, so we're just going to read the actual resurrection accounts. We're not going to build up the entire chapter, but it's in 2 Kings chapter 4, starting at verse 32. It says this in verse 32 of 2 Kings chapter 4. When Elisha came into the house, he saw the child lying dead on his bed. So he went in and shut the door behind the two of them and prayed to the Lord. Then he went up and laid on the child, putting his mouth on his mouth his eyes on his eyes, his hands on his hands, and he stretched himself upon him. The flesh of the child became warm. Then he got up again and walked back and forth in the house, and he went up and stretched himself upon him. The child sneezed 7 times, and the child opened his eyes. Then he summoned Gehazi and said, "Call this Shunammite." So he called her, and when she came to him, he said, "Pick up your son." Then she came and fell at his feet, bowing to the ground. Then she picked up her son and went out. So let's compare again. It's the story of a mother's son who's brought back to life. It's the same story with the same characters, another great man of God healing. But again, let's look at the core differences. The boy in Elisha's story is again not immediately resurrected. We see this honestly pretty strange ritual of Elisha getting on top of the boy, eyes on eyes, mouth on mouth, hands on hands. We see the prophet doing all of that just to get God's power to raise this boy back from the dead. Jesus, on the other hand, merely reaches out a hand and says a word, and the boy gets up. Secondly, in the story of Elisha, what do we read? Well, the writer in the book of 2 Kings makes a special mention to point out that the child sneezed 7 times. What an interesting thing to include. Why would he do that, include that? Well, I think it's to include that, well, this isn't instantaneous. The boy, it takes him a moment. He has to gather himself. And even then, after he sneezes 7 times and the life is back in him, he's not fully healed, but instead he must be carried by his mother. In Jesus' story, we don't see that. The boy is risen from the dead and so completely healed that it points to Jesus' deity. It points to the fact that Jesus has power from God over death. I lost my notes. So given the nature of this healing, how else should the people have reacted other than to declare Jesus as a great prophet? So not only do they declare Jesus in Luke 7 to be a great prophet and somebody from God, but we see the use of the word kurios, Lord, here. It's the second time in the book of Luke that this title is used. The first time being simply the last story. The centurion calls Jesus Lord when he addresses him in Luke 7:6. But now, the word Lord is not just used by the centurion. It's used by the narrator, by Luke. And debate kind of ranges as to exactly why Luke would use this word. But I would hold it to be that he's trying to showcase the public sentiment of who Jesus was. Jesus just does this amazing miracle. And how does the narrator Luke refer to Jesus now after 7 chapters? He doesn't just call him Jesus, he calls him Lord. Because by performing this miracle, that's what people see. Throughout the Gospels, Luke is the only writer that uses the word Lord anytime before the resurrection. All the other Gospels, they use it after the resurrection. It's used a bunch in the epistles and everything that follows. But in the Gospels, it's only in Luke that we see it before the resurrection. And I think it's to point to the fact that Luke is trying to show, people are recognizing, this is more than just a prophet. This is Lord come. This is God come. And it's a title that indicates both his authority, but it also indicates his deity. By using the title, Luke is ascribing huge significance to the sign that Jesus has power over death. So the initial reaction to the display of God's power is not immediate marveling, but we read in Luke that it's fear. It's similar to the resurrection in the Gospel of Mark chapter 16. The women approach the tomb and they tremble with fear, is what it says when they see the angel. This truly was a miracle that would have amazed them, but it inspired some fear in them as well as awe and amazement at the power of God. So while fear is present, the reaction is simultaneously recognizing Jesus is a great prophet, a prophet of God. The people don't worship Jesus, but they worship God because of Jesus. And in calling Jesus a prophet, they were comparing Jesus' works to the greatest prophets that Israel had ever seen. At the least, Jesus is now not a great healer or even someone similar to John the Baptist, but someone in leagues with the greats, in leagues with those great prophets. And next week we'll see word reaches John the Baptist. Word reaches this because this was an important miracle. I think Luke puts the two stories back to back to show likely this was the miracle that made John the Baptist perk up and pay attention. John the Baptist, a prophet himself, and go, goodness, this Jesus is something more. If we cut a little bit into next week, Luke 7, 20 through 22, we see that because of who Jesus is, John the Baptist sends his followers to ask, well, who are you? And what does Jesus respond? Does he say, I am the Christ? I am the Messiah? Does he answer directly? No. He says, look at my signs. Go back and report to John what you have seen and heard. Luke presents this story, this resurrection, as the story that leads John the Baptist to begin to understand Jesus is not just his cousin, not just an ordinary prophet or a healer, but maybe, just maybe, the Messiah. And as Luke loves to do, he's surveying the facts of what happened, but also surveying the implications and the reactions to the events that he just described. And as such, he closes with a note of how news spread throughout the surrounding countryside, to Judea and the other countries. News spread to John the Baptist. Perhaps, as I said, this is the very miracle that sets John the Baptist to begin to question who Jesus is. In the mind of the Israelites, the prophets were compared and contrasted, greater or lesser. And while people begin to see Jesus in the greater category, they still don't fully understand why he's here. Okay, a great prophet is dwelling among us, but why is he here? Just 2 chapters later, in Luke 9, Luke makes mention to note that speculation on who Jesus is not fully formed. Some still think he's John the Baptist, come again. Others think he's Elijah or a great prophet of old, we see in Luke 9. Thus, this isn't a direct pointing to Jesus being the true Messiah, but it's the beginning of where I think Luke sees that the people are beginning to understand that Jesus has great and marvelous power. The point that Luke is making is a transition, that people are finally seeing Jesus as someone important. And Luke is very careful with how he indicates this consensus. To the people, God had visited them through the act of resurrection by Jesus. And as I talked about in my intro, the public perception is shifting. He's no longer just an interesting teacher, but one of the great prophets. And this miracle is proof that God is visiting them. That's what Luke is writing. Yet, we can turn way far to the end of Luke. Jesus visits. He performs all these miracles, and then what does Luke 19:44 say? Well, Jesus is talking about how God has visited. God has visited them, yet you people, you miss the point. Jesus didn't just come to heal or to bring back dead boys to their mothers, but he came to bring all back to himself. God left his throne and became a man so that all could be saved. In the times during and following the apostolic era, the hot debate about Jesus was surrounding his personhood. See, many people back then were completely willing to admit, this Jesus, this guy that did miracles, that rose from the dead, he's God. Without question, he's God. But there's no way he was a man, because that just doesn't make sense. He couldn't be both God and man. And that was kind of the big debate of the day. That's largely what we think why John wrote the letters of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, to dispel this notion. It was to say that Jesus is both fully God and fully man. Today, the debate is not about whether Jesus is fully man. The debate, I'm sure as you guys have encountered it, is, well, he's not fully God. He's just another great teacher. Many religions teach about Jesus. They call him a great prophet, some a great teacher, but they don't state he is God. People argue that because Jesus himself never calls himself God, well, he obviously isn't God, because God would have said, I am God. We've actually been studying this very thing at Kids Night on Wednesday nights with your kids. We've taught them an acronym, and I'm going to teach it to you guys here today, of HANDS. Can you guys raise your hands with me? Let's be some little kids. Raise your hands, hands. Thank you, First Baptist. Oh, Windsor Christian, sorry. So, hands. All those 5 letters stand for something. H, Jesus shares in the honors due to God. A, Jesus shares the attributes of God. N, Jesus shares the names of God. D, Jesus shares the deeds that God does. And S, Jesus shares in the seat of God's throne. That's what we've been talking, or what we were talking about at Kids Night about a month ago. So let's explore that. To say that Jesus shares in the honors means that Jesus shares in the rightful position of God, rightful status of God. Jesus was given honor that only God should have been given when people worshiped him and prayed to him. Jesus' own disciples, after he rises from the dead in the book of Acts, they start praying to him. You wouldn't pray to your dead friend. You'd pray to your God, and that's what they do. A, Jesus shares in the attributes of God. Jesus, again and again, is just like God in how he loves people, how he shows compassion, all of the same attributes that we see that God has. So too does Jesus share in those. And Jesus shares in the names of God throughout the New Testament. Revelation calls Jesus the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, the title that would have in the Old Testament only been used for God. Yet the New Testament clearly articulates that Jesus has those same names. He shares in those titles because he himself is God. In the book of John, Jesus continually talks about this. I am the true vine. I am. A title that would have been very obvious to Old Testament people that, well, that's the title for God that God uses to Moses. We see, I think it's in John 8, Jesus says one of those I am statements. And then the very next verse, I think John 8:59, the people recognize this. They pick up stones to throw and kill him because they recognize it to be a claim that he is deity. Jesus shares in those names. And then D, Jesus shares in the deeds of God by showcasing God's power and performing miracles that only God can do. His miracles reflect that he has God's authority. And lastly, Jesus shares in the seat of God's throne, meaning Jesus is ruling on God's throne. Revelation 22, 1 through 3, we see Jesus on God's throne because Jesus is God. So we've been pointing to the fact that the whole Bible, you read a story of Jesus, you're going to see one of these in that story. So let's unpack Luke 7. How do we see that Jesus is God from these 5 things in Luke 7? Well, if we look at this passage, what do we see? Honor. Jesus is given honor. He performs this miracle, and immediately people worship God because of him, and they recognize him to be a great prophet. Immediately, his status changes, and they recognize this guy's important. Okay, but that doesn't quite point to his deity. Attributes. Jesus shares in the attributes. In this story, Jesus is overwhelmed with love and compassion towards the woman, just as God is overwhelmed with love and compassion towards us. Names. Again, we've talked about it. That name Lord is used here by Luke to talk about Jesus. Jesus is called Lord. He's called one of the great prophets. We'll skip deeds, seat. I don't really know where seat fits into this, but then let's go back to that last one, deeds, because I think that's where it most clearly proves through this deed that Jesus does that he is God. See, the whole point of the passage, the whole point of today's sermon is to highlight that Luke uses this story of the resurrection to reveal that Jesus shares the deeds that only God can do. When Jesus instantly and completely healed the boy, people took notice. No one other than someone directly sent by God could do that. And even the prophets directly sent by God couldn't do what Jesus did. Only, and their people are figuring this out, only God could resurrect somebody like that. His resurrection of the boy was something that was unseen by anyone else. No one had ever performed a miracle like that. And by performing this miracle, this sign, it pointed to the fact that Jesus was not only just sent by God, but that Jesus was God himself. And as we close here this morning, I want to challenge you guys to truly remember and to treat Jesus as God. We're living in Windsor, where people are more than willing to embrace Jesus as one of many different ways of salvation, where Jesus can coexist with the other pantheons of religions that exist out there. But that's not the truth. Jesus says that he is the only way, that he is God alone. Jesus is God himself, both fully God and fully man, the only person in the whole world with power over death, and the only one who, because he is deity, because he is God himself, can save us from our sins. Let's pray as we close this morning. Dear God, I thank you for this day. I thank you for this message and this wonderful story that Luke has provided for us that shows that you have power over death. We're so thankful that we've been given signs that point to the fact that you truly are God, that you're not just another great prophet, another great teacher, another great miracle worker, but that you are God, fully man, who can save us from our sins. I pray these things in your Son's precious and holy name. Amen.